November 20th, 1979. Mecca, the holiest place on earth, had never heard a scream. Until that morning. The sun had barely risen over the marble courtyards of the Grand Mosque when a sound shattered the most sacred. Silence known to Islam. A sound no believer ever expected to hear within the Kaaba's shadow. Thousands of worshippers fell to the ground. Some cried, some ran, many simply froze, unable to understand how the house of God had become a battlefield. Inside the smoke-filled corridors, a group of armed militants barricaded themselves, chanting that the end times had arrived, that the Mahdi had returned, that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was no longer legitimate. The world paused, while Saudi Arabia panicked. And far away in Tehran, a newly victorious revolutionary leader listened closely. Ayatollah Khomeini, a man whose revolution had just overthrown one of America's closest allies. A man who had declared the birth of a new era in the Islamic world. He silently watched the crisis unfold like a general studying a map before a war. For the first time in centuries, the Islamic world stood at a crossroads, and two powerful nations prepared to fight for its soul. This was the crack where the Saudi-Yemen rivalry was born, but no one knew it yet. Saudi forces attempted to storm the Grand Mosque, but every attempt met a wall of bullets. Snipers hid in minarets, explosives detonated in hallways. Hostages were herded like shields. And the kingdom's army, trained, disciplined, and proud, felt fear in a place where fear should not exist. Whispers spread. Is this Iran's doing? Is Khomeini behind this? Is the revolution spreading? Conspiracy filled the air faster than the smoke of gunfire. And in the Middle East, even a conspiracy can ignite 1,000 fires. Tehran denied involvement, but the Ayatollah's next statement shocked the Arab world. This attack is the work of America and their servants in Saudi Arabia. A single sentence, but it shattered what fragile trust existed. Because behind those words, behind that blame, lay a deeper ambition. Iran had just declared itself the moral leader of the Muslim world. And Saudi Arabia wasn't going to let that happen. Tehran in 1979 was a kingdom turned upside down. Crowds chanted in the streets. Images of the Shah burned. American influence crumbled overnight. And a new regime, loud, ideological, and uncompromising, claimed that Islam had to be purified. For the first time in centuries, Iran was no longer a quiet kingdom ruled by a monarch. It was a revolutionary state, armed with theology, nationalism, and the promise of exporting its ideology across borders. Saudi Arabia watched with dread. Because in Riyadh's palaces, a frightening realization spread. If Iran's revolution crossed the Gulf, if Shia communities in the region rose up, if Khomeini positioned himself as the leader of all Muslims, then the Saudi royal family's authority, both religious and political, was in danger. This was not just a rivalry. This was not just politics. This was a battle for leadership of the Muslim world. The militants who attacked the Grand Mosque were not Iranian. They were Saudi extremists who believed the kingdom had become corrupt and too close to the West. But the world didn't care about the details. Rumors spread faster than truth. Shiites have attacked Mecca. Iran is behind the uprising. Khomeini wants control of the holy sites. It didn't matter if the accusations were false. In geopolitics, perception is more powerful than reality. Saudi Arabia felt humiliated. Iran felt emboldened. The Muslim world felt shaken. And this was only the beginning. While Saudi forces fought to regain control of the Grand Mosque, something else was happening in Iran. Something darker, more strategic, and far more dangerous. Inside a dim room in Tehran, surrounded by clerics and revolutionary guards, Khomeini spoke slowly. Saudi Arabia claims leadership of Islam because it controls Mecca. But leadership is not a location. Leadership is a revolution. The men around him nodded. They knew what he meant. They would not challenge Saudi Arabia with armies. They would challenge it with ideology. They would fuel movements, empower proxies, influence communities, and push a vision of Islam that rejected monarchy, wealth, and Western alliances. This was Iran's message. You have Mecca, but we have the revolution. And in that moment, the shape of Middle Eastern politics changed forever. Saudi Arabia was rich, stable, and deeply connected to the West, especially the United States. Iran was revolutionary, unpredictable, and ready to rewrite the region's future. The kingdom realized something quickly. A revolution can spread like fire. And in the Middle East, fire often crosses borders with ease. So Riyadh began preparing for a long ideological war. They strengthened alliances. They funded religious institutions promoting their own interpretation of Islam. They invested billions into geopolitical influence. And they ensured that the West, especially Washington, would back them against Iran. Because the Saudis understood something crucial. When Iran talks about revolution, the entire region listens. But when Saudi Arabia talks about oil, the entire world listens. This was their counterweapon: global influence, energy, power, financial reach. The rivalry became inevitable. 1 year after the Mecca crisis, the next explosion arrived: political, violent, and unavoidable. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, invaded Iran. The Iran-Iraq War began. A brutal conflict. Millions affected. Table eyes. Saudi Arabia saw an opportunity. If Iran wins, advisors warned Riyadh, the revolution expands. If Iraq wins, Iran is contained. The kingdom quietly funneled billions into Saddam's war machine. Tehran saw this as betrayal. Not just political, but religious. Iranian state media broadcasted Saudi Arabia sides with tyrants. Saudi Arabia fears Islam's awakening. The lines were drawn. Two visions of the Middle East clashed. Saudi Arabia, protector of monarchy, stability, and Western-backed order. Iran, revolutionary force, anti-West, anti-monarchy, pro-resistance. The rivalry deepened into something bloodier. By 1980, two realities stood clear. Reality 1. Iran wanted to reshape the Middle East in its revolutionary image. Reality 2. Saudi Arabia wanted to stop that at all costs. Every conflict, every protest, every ideology, every religious sermon became a battlefield between the two. This was no longer a war of armies. This was a war of influence, a war of identity, a war of faith and power, a hidden war that would last decades. As the dust settled from the Mecca siege, as Iran's revolution spread its message, as Saudi Arabia tightened alliances, two giants had awoken. One armed with oil, one armed with ideology, one backed by the West, one opposed to it, one seeking stability, one promising change. A rivalry born inside Islam's holiest site, forged in revolution, and fueled by fear, was about to become the defining conflict of the Middle East for the next 40 years. And this was only the opening chapter. The dust of the 1979 Mecca siege had barely settled. Iran's revolution was still echoing through the streets of Tehran, and Saudi Arabia had just taken its first steps into a new kind of war. A war fought not with tanks or missiles, but with movements, sects, intelligence agencies, money, militias, secret alliances, and covert operations. A war where both sides rarely met face to face, yet their fingerprints were everywhere. This was the Shadow War, the next phase of the Saudi-Iran rivalry. A war beneath the surface, under the table, behind closed doors, inside mosques, and across borders. And it began in the mountains of Lebanon. In 1982, war drums echoed once again. Israel invaded Lebanon. Militias fought in narrow alleys as the Lebanese state collapsed piece by piece. In the chaos, Iran saw an opportunity not for conquest, but for influence. Iranian Revolutionary Guards quietly entered Lebanon through Syria. Their destination, the Shia communities of Beirut and the south. Their mission was simple but groundbreaking: create a loyal force. Train them, arm them, ideologically shape them, and give them a purpose. The result would become one of the most powerful non-state actors in modern history: Hezbollah, the Party of God. This was the first major piece on Iran's regional chessboard, a proxy force that was Shia, highly trained, revolutionary, loyal to Iran's supreme leader, and most importantly, able to challenge Israel, Saudi influence, and the Western presence in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia watched this with deep alarm. A new kind of weapon had appeared. Not an army, not a navy, not jets or tanks. A movement backed by Tehran's ideology that could spread, multiply, inspire, and radicalize. Iran had created a blueprint, a template for influence that Saudi Arabia could not ignore. The proxy war had begun. While Iran used ideology to build networks, Saudi Arabia used something else just as powerful: money, connections, religious networks, and global alliances. And nowhere was this more visible than in Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded. The world was shocked, but Saudi Arabia saw a chance to fight back against both communism and Iranian revolutionary messages. Together with the United States and Pakistan, Saudi Arabia funded and supported the Afghan Mujahideen. Weapons flowed, training camps grew, and volunteers arrived from across the Muslim world. Saudi Arabia became the spiritual and financial powerhouse behind the Afghan resistance. For Riyadh, this was the perfect counterbalance. Iran was exporting a Shia revolution. Saudi Arabia was promoting a Sunni global movement. Two ideas, two visions, two rival missions. The people fighting in Afghanistan thought they were part of a war against the Soviet Union. But in reality, they were foot soldiers in a much bigger conflict: the Saudi-Iran rivalry. Every dollar spent, every fighter recruited, every cleric mobilized was part of a struggle that neither side admitted publicly. But both understood perfectly to control the narrative of Islam and the future of the Middle East. By the early 1980s, the rivalry had spread beyond Lebanon and Afghanistan. It was now shaking the Gulf itself. Iran was locked in a brutal war with Iraq, and Saudi Arabia backed Saddam with billions. The Gulf states followed Riyadh's lead, fearing that if Iran won, revolutionary fires would jump across the water and ignite Shia populations in Bahrain, Kuwait, and even in Saudi Arabia's own oil-rich eastern province. Saudi intelligence reported unusual activity: secret meetings, underground cells, foreign sermons, and suspicious travel from Iran. Every movement had a shadow. Every whisper had meaning. Iran denied involvement, but everyone knew better. Saudi Arabia increased its internal security, arrested activists, strengthened its alliance with Washington, and began to use oil as its own geopolitical weapon. The Gulf, once calm, became a pond disturbed by two giants throwing stones at each other. The rivalry, born from Mecca in 1979, returned to the Holy City in 1987, with even more blood and political shock. Every year, Iranian pilgrims came to Mecca for Hajj, but by the mid-80s, these pilgrimages had turned political, filled with revolutionary slogans and chants against America and Saudi Arabia. Saudi authorities warned Iran repeatedly. This is Hajj, not a political stage, but the warnings were ignored. Then, in 1987, everything exploded. A massive clash erupted between Iranian pilgrims and Saudi security forces. Stones were thrown, tear gas fired, gunshots heard, hundreds died. Tehran erupted in rage. Crowds stormed the Saudi embassy and Saudi diplomats were attacked. Riyadh accused Iran of poisoning the sanctity of Hajj. Iran accused Saudi Arabia of murdering pilgrims. The Middle East trembled again. The holy cities had become symbols not of unity, but of a deep hatred, splitting the Muslim world into two camps. The message was clear: This rivalry was no longer just political. It was spiritual, emotional, and unstoppable. Two models now stood face to face. Iran's model was anti-West, revolutionary, and pro-resistance, supporting militias and mobilizing Shia communities under the banner of Islamic governance. Saudi Arabia's model was pro-West, monarchical, and focused on stability, using global religious institutions and financial influence as custodians of the two holy mosques. The fight was not just for borders or even for power. It was for the leadership of the Muslim world, who decides the narrative, who shapes religious authority, who defines Islam's political identity. This was a rivalry with no middle ground. By 1989, a stalemate had set in, but new dangers were emerging. The Iran-Iraq War ended, leaving Iran wounded but defiant. Saudi Arabia emerged, richer but deeply anxious. The Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan, and the militias trained with Saudi funding gained global confidence. Hezbollah grew stronger, more disciplined, and more sophisticated. Both sides had invested heavily in proxies and influence, but neither had won. Iran had militias. Saudi Arabia had clerical networks. Iran had ideological fervor. Saudi Arabia had economic reach. A balance of fear and influence held the region in fragile tension. But then, a new crisis reshaped the entire Middle East. In 1990, Saddam Hussein, the very dictator Saudi Arabia had funded to contain Iran, turned his tanks towards Kuwait. He seized the country in hours. The region froze. Saudi Arabia panicked. For the first time, Riyadh invited American troops onto Saudi soil, a decision Iran used as propaganda for years. Tehran whispered to the Muslim world, "Look at the guardians of Mecca. They depend on foreign armies." It was a devastating accusation. Saudi Arabia argued it had no choice. Iran said it was proof of betrayal. The rivalry deepened further. After the Gulf War, the 1990s entered a period of tension disguised as calm. But beneath the surface, both sides dug deeper. Iran strengthened Hezbollah Shia parties in Iraq, ties with Syria, and religious networks across the Gulf. Saudi Arabia strengthened its influence in Pakistan, its ties to Egypt and Jordan, and its relationships with Washington and London. The battlegrounds expanded: Lebanon, Iraq, Afghanistan, Sudan, Pakistan, Bahrain, Yemen, Syria. Everywhere you looked, the rivalry cast a shadow, sometimes visible, often hidden, always present. The turn of the century changed everything. The attacks of September 11th reshaped the world. And although neither Saudi Arabia nor Iran planned those attacks, both would be transformed by them. The US invaded Afghanistan, then Iraq. The Middle East's map shook once again. In that chaos, Iran saw an opportunity. Saudi Arabia saw a threat. Iraq fell into the hands of factions sympathetic to Tehran, and Iranian influence spread like wildfire. Saudi Arabia watched its worst nightmare happen in slow motion. An Iraqi government friendly to Iran, right on its border, with militias trained by Iranian advisors and political leaders who respected Tehran more than Riyadh. The rivalry entered its most dangerous phase yet. By the mid-2000s, Iran was rising, and Saudi Arabia was resisting. Hezbollah grew stronger. Iraq became Iran's backyard. The Gulf grew tense. Lebanon became unstable. Afghanistan was uncertain, and Yemen was quietly boiling. The Middle East was a chessboard, but both sides were now playing with real fire. The rivalry was no longer about influence. It was about survival. And then came the most explosive era of all, the Arab Spring, the Syrian war, ISIS, Yemen's collapse, and the fall of old orders. A chapter where Saudi Arabia and Iran finally confronted each other, not just through proxies, but through entire nations collapsing between them. The early 2000s had set the stage. Iraq had fallen. Militias were rising. Old alliances were cracking. Saudi Arabia and Iran were no longer fighting in the shadows. They were moving towards something darker, louder, and more uncontrollable. A collision. A collision of ideology. A collision of ambition. A collision of destiny. And the spark that ignited this new age was about to erupt. The year is 2011. The streets of Tunisia shake with chants. Then Egypt, then Libya, then Bahrain, then Syria, then Yemen. One domino falls after another. This is the Arab Spring, the earthquake of the Middle East. Every regime looks fragile. Every leader looks vulnerable. Every city feels like a powder keg waiting for a spark. People demand change. Dictators panic. Armies split. Militias appear. Chaos spreads like wildfire. But beneath this wave of revolutions, a silent geopolitical earthquake is happening. The collapse of old regimes means new openings, new power vacuums, new battlegrounds. And both Saudi Arabia and Iran see a once-in-a-generation opportunity. One tries to preserve the old order. The other tries to replace it. The rivalry is no longer a Cold War. It is becoming a firestorm. Bahrain was the first test, the first flashpoint. A small island kingdom with deep ties to Riyadh, but with a large Shia population full of grievances. Protests erupt. The streets flood with anger. The government is shaken to its core. Iran publicly supports the protesters. Saudi Arabia sees this as a direct threat to possible Iranian foothold right on its doorstep. Then, in March 2011, the world watches as Saudi tanks roll across the causeway into Bahrain. The message to Tehran is crystal clear. This is our red line. Iran condemns the move. Saudi Arabia tightens its grip. The Middle East has just seen the first major chapter of the Arab Spring rivalry unfold. But Bahrain was only the beginning. The real storm, the real inferno, the real collision was waiting in Syria. Syria was not just another Arab Spring uprising. It was a geopolitical earthquake, a battlefield of empires, a playground for intelligence agencies, a chessboard where all regional powers placed their bets. When protests erupted against Bashar al-Assad, Saudi Arabia saw a golden opening. Oppose Assad, cut Iran's influence, and break the Tehran-Damascus-Hezbollah axis. Iran saw the exact opposite. For them, it was about defending Assad, protecting that axis, and maintaining their highway to Lebanon. And so began one of the deadliest proxy wars of the 21st century. Saudi Arabia supported rebel groups with money, weapons, and diplomatic pressure. Iran sent advisors, militias, its own revolutionary guards, and eventually thousands of fighters to prop up the regime. Hezbollah joined the battlefield. Saudi-backed rebels pushed back. Iranian drones flew overhead. Saudi Arabia increased funding. In response, Iran mobilized Shia militias from Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. The war was brutal. Cities were reduced to ashes. Millions were displaced. Hundreds of thousands were killed. But strategically, Iran won. Assad survived. Tehran successfully held the corridor stretching from Iran through Iraq and Syria, all the way to Lebanon. Hezbollah emerged more battle-hardened than ever. For Saudi Arabia, it was a major setback. The balance of power in the region was shifting. While Syria raged, another storm was gathering on the southern border of Saudi Arabia. In Yemen, the Houthis, a Zaidi Shia movement, seized the capital city of Sana'a. Saudi Arabia immediately saw this as an Iranian expansion, an unacceptable threat right on its flank. While Iran encouraged the Houthis politically and provided some support for Riyadh, this was a step too far. In 2015, Saudi Arabia launched Operation Decisive Storm, leading a coalition to push back the Houthis. But the conflict quickly spiraled into a nightmare. Missiles were fired into Saudi territory. Drones targeted airports and critical oil facilities. Naval mines threatened shipping lanes in the Red Sea. A devastating humanitarian crisis was broadcast across the world. For Saudi Arabia, the war became a grueling test of its military credibility. For Iran, it was a low-cost way to keep its rival bogged down and under pressure. This war also unleashed a new era of warfare in the Middle East. The drone age, cheap drones, precision strikes, and asymmetric power became the new weapons of choice. And this technology would soon be used in a way that shocked the entire world. Then, in January 2016, a single execution shook the region to its core. Saudi Arabia executed Nimr al-Nim, a prominent Shia cleric accused of inciting unrest. Iran's reaction was explosive. Angry crowds stormed the Saudi embassy in Tehran. Windows were shattered. Furniture was set on fire. Diplomats were evacuated in a hurry. In response, Saudi Arabia severed all diplomatic ties with Iran. The rivalry had reached its boiling point. Diplomacy was dead. Accusations filled the air. The proxy wars only intensified. The Middle East felt like a gunpowder barrel, just waiting for a match. But the most dramatic moment was still to come. Early one morning in 2019, Saudi oil workers heard a strange buzzing sound in the sky. Then, boom, boom, boom. Multiple explosions rocked Saudi Arabia's Abqaiq and Khoree oil facilities, the very heart of global oil production. Drones and missiles struck with shocking precision. In an instant, Saudi oil production was cut in half. Global markets panicked. The world was stunned. Saudi Arabia and its Western allies blamed Iran and its proxies. Tehran denied any involvement. But the message was unmistakable. The rivalry had entered a terrifying new phase, where a single, calculated strike could threaten global economic stability. The world held its breath, expecting the worst. Everyone expected escalation. More conflict, more fire, more proxy wars. But then, something unexpected happened. Of course, the rivalry didn't magically disappear. The proxies still existed. The wounds were still fresh. The mistrust ran deep. Economic transformation and building mega projects like NEOM. It's looking for a post-oil future, and that requires peace. Iran, on the other hand, is desperate for sanctions relief, regional recognition, and the survival of its political system while retaining its influence in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. Both sides have realized a crucial truth. The cost of all-out war is unbearable. The future requires stability, and the world is changing fast. The rivalry is no longer a raging firestorm. It is now a strategic chess match, a rivalry of influence, not invasion, of diplomacy, not destruction. It's about calculated moves, not open war, but a critical question remains. Has the rivalry truly ended? Or is it only sleeping? The Middle East has changed many times. Empires have risen and fallen. Borders have shifted. Ideologies have clashed. Cold wars have heated up. But one thing has stayed constant. Saudi Arabia and Iran remain two giants with two very different visions for the region. Sometimes they cooperate. Sometimes they compete. And sometimes they collide. This rivalry is not just a moment in time. It is a story, a cycle. a struggle written in the ink of geopolitics, religion, identity, and history. And its next chapter has not yet been written. This documentary is based solely on verified historical events, publicly available records, and credible geopolitical analyses. No part of this content promotes hate, violence, or discrimination. Its purpose is educational, offering a cinematic retelling of real events to help viewers understand the complex history of the Middle East. If you found this documentary powerful and eye-opening, make sure to like the video, comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more real history thrillers. Sharing this documentary with friends helps us bring more of these untold, shocking, and cinematic stories from world history to you. Thanks for watching.